In this talk, we will learn about different features of fish and amphibians, which are also known as anamniote vertebrates. Vertebrates are organisms that belong to the domain Eukarya and the kingdom of Animalia. They are bilaterally symmetric organisms that are multicellular. All cells are eukaryotic, and these organisms are heterotrophs that have a vertebral column. Since all vertebrates show bilateral symmetry, they are grouped under the clade of Bilatria. Bilatrians can be divided into three clades, which are Lophotrochozoa, Ecdysozoa, and Deuterostomia. Out of these three clades, Deuterostomia is the clade that includes all vertebrates, including some invertebrates. The vertebrates in turn belong to the clade Chordata that comes under the clade of Deuterostomia. All chordates show four features at least some stage of their life. These include the presence of a hollow nerve cord that is formed early during development, as well as a notochord, which is a thin rod of tissues that is formed before the nerve cord forms. In some cases, the notochord may be replaced by the vertebral column as development proceeds. Chordates also show the presence of pharyngeal slits that can also be called as pharyngeal pouches or clefts, and these are present in all vertebrate embryos. Chordates also show the presence of a post-anal tail. There are three main subphyla or clades in chordates, which include the Urochordata, Cephalochordata, and Vertebrata. All organisms that belong to Cephalochordata or Urochordata are invertebrates. However, most chordates are actually vertebrates. Vertebrates are those chordates that have a backbone or a vertebral column. This vertebral column is usually made up of vertebrae. The main function of the vertebral column is to protect the spinal cord, which is a part of the nervous system. Vertebrates form their own group of animals and are not included in invertebrates. By performing molecular analyses, scientists have been able to group vertebrates into different clades. Now, all vertebrates show the presence of vertebrae, and hence any organism that has vertebrae can be grouped into two different clades. The first clade, which includes the earliest vertebrates, is called as cyclostomes. These are vertebrates that don't have a jaw, and some fish are grouped into this clade. The other clade are vertebrates that have a jaw. These include fish and all the other vertebrates, which include amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals. Fish are the earliest vertebrates that were formed on Earth. A lot of analyses has been done, and scientists have come to a consensus that fish evolved from these invertebrate organisms called lancelets. These are blade-like animals that belong to the clade Cephalochordata. While the earliest fish do show similarities with lancelets, they also show some differences which makes them vertebrates. The earliest fish did show the presence of a vertebral column that was made up of cartilage. They also showed the presence of eyes. These earliest fish that were formed were able to respire using gills, the way lancelets do. While most modern-day fish have jaws and fins, this wasn't the case with the earliest fish. The earlier fishes did evolve primitive fins, as shown in the figure, but none of these organisms exist today, and they have all become extinct. The earliest fish that were formed had no jaws, and hence they come under the clade of Cyclostoma. Cyclostoma refers to the fact that they had one mouth that was in the form of a circle. Millions of years ago, there were many different cyclostomes that were present on Earth. However, most of them have become extinct. The extant cyclostomes, or the ones that still exist today, are those that have a vertebral column of cartilage. There are two main types of cyclostomes present today, the first one being hagfish and the second one being lampreys. Over time, the cyclostomes evolved, and one key innovation event was the formation or evolution of the jaw. The jaw is a part of the mouth, and it is thought that it evolved from these structures or skeletal rods called anterior gill arches. The function of these anterior gill arches was to support the pharyngeal gill slits that are normally present in all chordates. Once the jaw was formed, we're able to see the clade Gnathostoma being present. These are organisms that have a jaw as part of their mouth. The earliest gnathostomes evolved their jaw in such a way that only a portion of the upper jaw was attached to the skull. The lower jaw was not attached to the skull at all. The earliest gnathostomes were the fish called Plecoderms, and one of the most popular Plecoderms is Dunkleosteus, as shown in the figure. We're able to see that not only was a jaw formed, but the organism became more armored, and that way the outer part of the body became much more stronger and harder to provide protection. As time passed, the gnathostomes evolved, and along with them, the jaw evolved. As the jaw evolved, the lower jaw became attached to the skull. By having the lower jaw attached to the skull, the mouth can now open much wider, and now the organism is able to eat different types of organisms because it is able to use its mouth in different ways. As the fish evolved, their skeletal cartilage became calcified. And what we mean by that is that we had crystals of calcium carbonate be deposited on the cartilage on the outer part, and hence it provided a much more rigid structure to the animal. Such fish whose skeletal system is made up of cartilage came under the clade of chondrichthyes. In these fish, the teeth and the fins also evolved. They still respired with gills, and the water was able to enter the gills as they swam. We are able to see some members of chondrichthyes even today in the form of sharks, rays, and skates. It should be noted that the way the body evolved, the shark, even today, is considered as a top predator. While chondrichthyes was formed, in which the skeletal system was made up of cartilage, we had another group of fish starting to evolve, which were those where the endoskeleton became ossified. In this case, instead of having calcium carbonate deposit on the cartilage was actually converted into bone. And thus, we're able to see the formation of bony fish. An advantage of bone is that it is much more stronger than cartilage. Thus, the fish that had bone as part of its skeleton were called as the bony fish. In today's world, the bony fish are the most species-rich group of all vertebrates, and they belong to the clade of Osteichthyes. While bone is strong and is able to support muscle in a much better way, one of the disadvantages of bone is that it is heavy. In this instance, cartilage is more advantageous because it is much lighter than bone. In the case of bony fish, because of the heaviness of the bone, they had to undergo certain adaptations in order to function well. And one such adaptation is the formation of the swim bladder. The swim bladder is an organ that helps bony fish to be buoyant or be able to stay in a certain depth in water. As mentioned before, it's difficult for them to do that on their own because bone is heavy and hence they would have a tendency to sink. The swim bladder prevents this because it is a gas-filled sac. So it is like a balloon that is present inside the body of the fish. And it allows the bony fish to regulate the buoyant density so that they can stay at a certain depth in water and not sink. The gas that is present in the swim bladder is usually obtained from the blood of the fish. It enters through a region called as the gas gland and exits back into the blood through another region called as the oval body. Thus, the swim bladder is an important adaptation in bony fish that allows it to swim effectively at a certain depth in the water. Another adaptation in the bony fish was the formation of the operculum, or the gill cover. The operculum is able to protect the gills, but it also helps pump water over the gills when the fish is stationary. And thus, unlike sharks that have to keep moving in order to allow water to enter the gills and hence help them respire, in the case of bony fish, the fish can respire even if they are not moving because the operculum helps pump water over the gills and allows them to absorb the oxygen present in the water. Let us now look at the different types of bony fish. The bony fish can be grouped into two main groups. The first one are the Rayfinned Fish, or Actinopterygii. In the Rayfinned fish, each fin is supported by parallel bony rays. And some of these fins have been highlighted, where we're able to see the presence of thin, slender bone and multiple bones forming these bony rays that are parallel to one another. These fish normally don't have any muscle present in the fins and are most of the aquatic Osteichthyans. Thus, most of the bony fish that we find are actually ray-finned fish. The second type of bony fish are the lobe-finned fish, or Sarcopterygii. They have paired fins, and when we look at some of these fins, they have rod-shaped bones that are surrounded by a thick layer of muscle. And these are seen normally in the pelvic and pectoral fins. Thus, unlike the ray-finned fish, there is considerable amount of muscle that is present in some of the fins. There are some different types of lobe-finned fish, including coelacanths. For a long time, it was thought that the coelacanths had become extinct. However, one type of coelacanth was observed, and hence we do see one type of coelacanth in nature today. Another type of lobe-finned fish are the lungfish. They can breathe very briefly out of water because they have these primitive lungs. There aren't that many around, but we do have lungfish still present with us today in the world. The third type of bony fish are the tetrapod fish. In these fish, the pelvic and the pectoral fins evolved to form limb-like structures. This was a key innovation event because it allowed these organisms to support their body weight on these fins as well as to try to move around using these fins on land. Now, while they aren't land-dwelling organisms in any way, they set the stage for the formation of organisms that could later dwell on land or become terrestrial. The tetrapod fish gave rise to different organisms that would end up with 4 limbs, and they all today have been grouped into the monophyletic clade of Tetrapoda. All these animals that are present in Tetrapoda are currently land-dwelling vertebrates. But if we go back in time to see how this transition happened, then by studying the fossil of Tiktaalik, scientists were able to see different features of fish as well as tetrapods. When we look at the fish features, Tiktaalik had scales as well as fins, which are normally seen in fish, as well as gills and lungs. When we look at the tetrapod features, Tiktaalik showed the presence of a neck that is normally not seen in fish. It showed ribs as well as the skeleton of the fin was able to show an arrangement of bones that is normally observed in tetrapods and not in fish. It had a flat skull as well as eyes on top of a skull, which are also characters of tetrapods. And hence, we believe that Tiktaalik is the intermediate organism between the fish and the tetrapod and shows the transition of fish becoming tetrapods. The land-dwelling tetrapods are the amphibians, and thus Tiktaalik shows how fish transitioned and evolved to give rise to amphibians. A fossil of another organism called Ichthyostega showed that it was one of the first amphibians whose fossil was found. Ichthyostega had sturdy limbs and long, broad, overlapping ribs. These overlapping ribs could form a cage-like structure that we see today in the form of a rib cage, where the lungs and the heart could reside. Thus, Ichthyostega was able to show many features of a land-dwelling organism and hence was not a fish anymore. Thus, we are able to see how lobe-finned fish were able to undergo changes to their bodies, especially their pectoral and pelvic fins, to form these tetrapod-like organisms that evolved further to form more land-dwelling organisms like amphibians. Let us now look at amphibians, which belong to the class of Amphibia and, as we mentioned before, evolved from lobe-finned fish. Amphibians are tetrapods because they have 4 limbs. The word amphibian indicates that this organism lives both ways of life. What we mean by that is that it has an aquatic larval stage which is more fish-like. And as the organism develops to form an adult, the adult has a more terrestrial stage and thus lives on land. Hence, amphibians have a part of their life in the water and another part of their life on land. There are certain key features of amphibians that include the presence of legs. All amphibians have legs that have allowed them to adapt to life on land. All amphibians have lungs that allowed them to respire and promote gaseous exchange. They also show the presence of pulmonary veins and have separated the pulmonary circuit. This is different from fish. In the case of amphibians, we are able to see blood vessels dedicated to bringing blood to and from the lungs to the heart, and another set of vessels that are allowed to take blood from the heart to other parts of the body and bring it back to the heart. All amphibians also show cutaneous respiration, where they also are able to perform gas exchange through their skin. This supplements the gas exchange that is performed in the lungs. The heart of the amphibian is also slightly different from that of fish. Instead of having a two-chamber heart, amphibians have a partially divided heart that has now become a three-chambered heart. There are many different types of amphibians, but they can all be grouped into three main orders. The first order is called as Anura, which means without a tail. These includes all the frogs and toads that are present around us. The next order is called Caudata or Urodelia, and this means that they do have a visible tail. And this includes the salamanders and newts. The third order of amphibians is Apoda, which means without legs. These include caecilians, which look like worms. They don't have any limbs and hence have lost their limbs, but this is a secondary adaptation, which means that their ancestors did indeed have limbs, but they have lost it through the process of evolution. Both fish and amphibians do show sexual modes of reproduction. When it comes to fertilization of the fish and amphibian eggs, the fertilization can be external, which means it happens outside the animal's body. In this case, as shown in the figure, the female lay the eggs in the water while the male release their sperm that will fertilize the eggs in the water. There are some fish and amphibians that show internal fertilization, where in this case the eggs are present in the female's body and the sperm are able to fertilize the eggs inside the female's body. In most cases, fertilization does tend to be external in fish and amphibians. Now, when the eggs are laid, they are always laid in water. If for some reason the eggs are laid in land, they do not survive because they dry out or undergo desiccation. This is because the eggs do not have any fluid-filled cavity called as an amnion to prevent the drying out or desiccation of the egg and the embryo that is present inside the egg. Such eggs that do not have an amnion are called as anamniotic eggs. And hence fish and amphibians are also come under the anamniotic vertebrates. With this, we come to the end of our talk, where we learned about different characteristics of vertebrates and the origins of the first vertebrates, which were fish. We also learned about different characteristics of fish and types of fish. We learned about the evolution of fish and how they evolved from jawless fish to the fish that had jaws. We then learned about how some fish evolved to form amphibians and different characteristics of amphibians.